The Idle Gambler's Death. Once, in the sands of Thunder Junction, there was a traveling gambler who never lost because they never played fair, and was always followed by an honestly probably pretty justified mob of angry outlaws chasing them from town to town. The exploits of this gambler grew so remarkable that one day, upon entering a small, lonely town, the gambler was shocked to discover that their reputation had preceded them, and they were immediately thrown in prison. But the gambler was surprised and delighted to find that the mayor didn't want the gambler's head. No, indeed, the mayor came to the gambler's jail cell with an offer of employment. The gambler would become a Bakuto, working in the gambling house to take the hard-earned money of the poor working folk, and in exchange for a fair cut of the gambler's winnings, the mayor would not have the gambler thrown in prison again, or killed, or chased out of town. The gambler, seeing this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for wealth and safety and comfort, leapt upon this offer with nary a moment's hesitation. And indeed, in the gambling house, they grew filthy rich and accrued their usual mob of vicious haters. And, true to his word, when the mob came for the gambler's head, the mayor chased them away. But the gambler's heart could not be so simply swayed, and when the mayor demanded his agreed share of the gambler's winnings, the gambler refused, unless the mayor bested them in a game of chance. And so, the clever mayor had the gambler shot to death, because all landlords are bastards, and the gamblers should have gotten out of there while they still had the chance. And that's the story of the Idle Gambler's Death. Domain Expansion, Zasatsu Bakuto. JESKAI Arcane Bombardment is a gambler's dream, built around the fantastic interaction between two incredibly janky red enchantments, Arcane Bombardment and Widespread Thieving. Arcane Bombardment is a 6-mana enchantment that builds up a snowballing stockpile of spells to cast for free, while Widespread Thieving is an engine that provides you with a treasure token every time you cast a multicolored spell, regardless of from where you've cast that spell or how much mana you've actually paid to cast it. At its base level, Widespread Thieving is a 3-mana enchantment that turns your 2-mana multicolored spells into 1-mana multicolored spells, or alternatively 2-mana spells that ramp you for the next turn. But together, Bombardment and Thieving become an engine, where Bombardment generates multicolored spells for no mana every turn, and Widespread Thieving turns those free spells into mana ramp. And so we have constructed this incredibly powerful instant and sorcery slot machine. How then do we survive to casting a 6-mana enchantment that does nothing by itself? You might think to yourself, oh, simple, we ramp with treasure spells or we cheat it out. No, unfortunately, the days of Goldspan Dragon and Forgotten Realms treasure generation are behind us. Now we simply use best standards array of fantastic 2-mana multicolored spells to just desperately hold on and white knuckle our way to having enough treasure that we can just hard cast the Arcane Bombardment, play literally any instant or sorcery, and pray to our god of choice that we hit exactly the spell from our graveyard that we need Arcane Bombardment to cast for free. But most of the time we're just using spot burn and board clears until we get to a point where we start the engine going and we've either completely exhausted the aggro deck or we're just going to run over any control deck, assuming we don't play like complete idiots. Now, the 2-mana spells that bring this all together are, in one take, Slick Sequence, Lightning Helix, Sacred Fire, and Faithful Mending. And if I was a more creative person, I feel like I could make a haiku out of that. These spells are all just good enough that casting them as turn 2 interaction with the board keeps you alive, and then really come into their own once they're fed into the engine of the Arcane Bombardment. Drawing cards, gaining life, It's all absolutely incredible. And that's before you account for the fact that they're generating free treasure tokens for you. Now, obviously, one piece of interaction on turn 2 is not going to keep you alive against even the dirtliest of decks. So the deck makes sure to play a good number of Brotherhood's End, Ill-Timed Explosion, and Big Score. Obviously, Big Score is not a piece of removal, but it is an instant speed, treasure generation, and card draw. And you'd be surprised how often holding up the 4-mana Big Score is really very important for getting the Arcane Bombardment down on time. But also, we just can't have a deck of entirely cheap cards, or Ill-Timed Explosion doesn't work, because we can't keep feeding Arcane Bombardments into it. That would defeat the whole purpose. By the way, Brotherhood's End, besides being a fantastic sweeper if you have the 18 red sources in your deck to cast it reliably on turn 3, is coming into its own for having an alternate mode of annihilate all of the synthesizer decks on board. Just absolutely hose every possible set of artifacts that a person could be using to build up combos. Because it turns out that when people think they're safe from temporary lockdown, they put a lot of stock in 3-mana cards that get absolutely cracked by Brotherhood's End. This is one of those deck videos that almost nobody asked for, but it's just so much fun that I absolutely have to make it. And speaking of things that nobody asked for, like and subscribe. Now, an incredibly understated part of this deck is forming the mana base. And it's expensive. I'm sorry. We're a 3-color deck that's doing a bunch of incredibly greedy things. Yeah, we're going to use rare lands. The way to craft a good curve is to look at what you absolutely have to do on each turn, and then construct numbers based on that. For example, we don't have any 1-drops. We don't want to be playing 1-drops because it's much, much, much better for us to be playing a turn 1 tap land that either surveils or lets us fill out the deck with lands that come into play untapped later. On turn 2, we absolutely need to be playing a piece of interaction, so we need some lands that come into play untapped on turn 2. Personally, I use the pain lands because it's better to have cards that come into play untapped all the time, and we really need those double color lands in order to hit our turn 3 Brotherhood's End to stay alive more often than not. And speaking of which, turn 3 is where you absolutely need some comes into play untapped red producing lands, because you need to be both producing 2 different colors of mana on turn 2, and then 2 of 3 red mana on turn 3 to cast a Brotherhood's End, which is wild. If you haven't ever gone down the rabbit hole of how to figure out exactly the kinds of mana that you need for a particular deck, it's gonna just eat your entire life. In this case, let me shortcut it for you. We need 18 red sources for Brotherhood's End, most of which would come into play untapped on turn 3. We need 14 white sources to be casting our 2-mana spells on turn 2, and we need 14 blue sources to be casting our 2-mana blue spells on turn 2. Now, if you're wondering how we get 46 colored mana sources in 24 lands, well, that's where the wild cards come into play. Zasatsu Bakuto is the best domain expansion, and if we were allowed to give decks funny names, that would absolutely be the name of this deck, because this is a strategy about surviving until we can run the jackpot machine, and every spell that we've cast in preparation for the jackpot machine makes it more likely that we get the jackpot, and once we get the jackpot, we are indestructible. As long as we still have gas in the tank. This is how to build. I'm Michael from Michael the Gathering. Give my regards to you wild cards. G'day, and good laddering.